Hi, welcome back. So this is going to be Unit 3, Day 5. Make sure you have your history notebook out and you're taking notes as you move through the video. Make sure you complete the vocabulary for this video as well, either highlighting them in your notebook or writing down the word and definition. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we'll be talking about the British East India Company, the French East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the British Raj, Saraket Islam, Java, French Indochina, Robert Clive, the Battle of Plassey, the Sepoy Mutiny, Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Mouridiyya Brotherhood, the French West Africa, and Nigeria. Key concepts is going to be the cause of colonialism, colonialism in India and its effects, colonialism in Java and its effects, and colonialism in Indochina and its effects. So, in the early stages of the imperial advance of European exploration and colonization, it's really going to start with these joint stock companies. Now, remember last unit we talked about joint stock companies where people would buy certain shares of a company, and then those companies would go to an area, set up a colony with that semi-autonomous and semi kind of. But they're really self-rule. They have some oversight, but they're really self-rule. Some examples of this would be the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and the French East India Company. Now, these kind of joint stock companies would go into an area and then establish themselves on the top of social hierarchies. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Europeans did not have to accommodate themselves to the the environment and things, and a lot of syncretism taking place with housing, dresses, and work habits. But that's happening in both directions. So while they're bringing European style architecture, they're also taking into consideration the local architecture. Now, most colonial representatives, or all colonial representatives, were male, and liaisons with indigenous women were common. Right, this leads to a blending of cultures and blending of mixed groups, which are kind of not liked by either the indigenous population or the European population. And again, as it says, it leads to more syncretism of styles and religions. Now let's talk about the Dutch East Indies. Now, when the Dutch arrive in, like Indonesia, which is, of course, is south of Indochina, they were satisfied with just being kind of vassals of the Sultan, where they would given plots of land where they can work and do things. But after 1670, the Dutch are going to control most of Java, and the local sultans were really only allowed to kind of keep their small little kingdoms on some of the islands and some of the outlying islands. Well, the Dutch are going to get tired of that too, and they're going to create a new political system when they're systematically means like deliberately, are going to replace all the local rulers with colonial states. And they're going to impose modern bureaucratic systems. Now, that's for like the upper echelon of the government, but for like the local mayoral stuff and town running things, they left those people in charge. Like the elites are in charge so long as they cooperate with the Dutch and fulfill their economic quotas. Now, what do you think happens when they don't fulfill those economic quotas? Well, eventually they're going to be ousted and kicked out, and then replaced with a colonial run puppet. But for right now, all right, as long as you're meeting your quotas and you're doing your stuff, everything's going to be fine. Now, we also, during this time, we have the rise of Saraket Islam, or the Islamic Union. And this is going to be, it's going to unite different types of Indonesian Muslims into one movement. This is going to be modeled after the Indian movements, Chinese Revolution, and parties. And it's really going to begin to kind of truly, kind of push back against the Dutch. And over time, they will kind of regain a lot of their powers and things, but it'll still be very much Dutch controlled. So again, Dutch East Indies, that's going to be kind of Java, the Strait of Malacca, and places in Indonesia. Let's talk about French Indochina. Now, the French are going to fight the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and the Siamese to acquire colonies and protectorates in Southeast Asia. Now, if you remember back to last unit, we talked about Vietnam before, and they've really kind of always had kind of somebody trying to conquer them, and they've always been in a state of revolution. So when the French come in and take over, the French will always be pretty much fighting against the Vietnamese people, and these are going to be in peasant guerrilla insurrections, Buddhist rebellions against the French influence. Like, the French will always have an extremely difficult time like keeping their colonies. I mean, they'll keep them, right? They'll put down the rebellions, but it's still more difficult for them to do so. Then we have state structure in Vietnam and Indochina. As you know, Vietnam began as an imperial state with an Confucian bureaucracy after China. So, because remember, China always had hesitantly influenced Vietnam, and Vietnam only took like the best parts. But the French are going to introduce the European administration, taxing, and fiscal systems. But they're really going to leave a lot of the ruling kind of Confucian ruling elites in place. Traditional social structures are going to be left in place, but with a little influence. So, you know, as long as the ruling elites are, you know, keeping their people in line and paying homage and doing everything they can for the for the French. Sorry, the French aren't really going to be involved. Now, some kind of cultural influences is that culturally, many Vietnamese are going to be converted to Roman Catholicism by the French. The French practice a policy of cultural assimilation, which means they're kind of trying to really push to kind of have the Vietnamese become French, even sending many Vietnamese elites to colleges in France so that they can push, you know, the French culture on the Vietnamese people. It's really just kind of this policy of assimilation and rebellion. So again, French Indochina, Siam, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, kind of southern China, south of China, east of India area. All right, now let's talk about the British in India. Now the British are going to assume a position of superiority. They are going to gain control of all of India during the 7 Years' War, or the French-Indian War. And this is really what's going to establish British control. The big victory was won by Robert Clive, who's going to defeat the French-backed supporters in India at the Battle of Plassey. Clive is going to be able to achieve this because he had the help of Hindu bankers. And this is really going to secure British control of India, especially over France. And the way he's going to do is he's going to bring a lot of... So we have like the ruler of Bengal, and he's going to take everybody who doesn't like the ruler of Bengal and cause them to fight the French-backed Indian people. So again, Battle of Plassey is when the British really start to gain control of India. Now, it's not always great, right? So we have a group known as the Sepoy, and the Sepoy are going to be a mixture of Muslims and Hindu against British rule. Now, the reason the Sepoy and they lead to the Sepoy Rebellion is because a rumor was started that the British were taking were dipping their gunpowder charges in cow fat and pig fat. Well, if you didn't know, you will, right? That to fire a musket, you have to have a little bag full of gunpowder that you stuff in it, or you pour the gunpowder in. So you have to use your mouth to rip open that, right? Well, Muslims can't eat pork and Hindus can't eat beef, so if they have to stick the powder charge in their mouth to rip off to open the bag, right? They're ingesting pork and beef, which causes a rebellion. Now, after that, so after the British East India Company can't really fight it, so the United Kingdom the British had to step in and take over after the Sepoy Rebellion, and this leads to the United Kingdom, or Britain, ruling India directly. They introduce a cabinet system, civil service appointments were regulated. Well, this leads to kind of the first nationalist movements, Hindu and Muslim reform movements. Political leaders such as Gandhi began to unite urban, rural, and social structures. They have religious activities to unify the nation. They have Western-educated elites lead to reforms. Right? They set up schools and things, and this directly leads to the first Indian National Congress, which seeks independence for a united Hindu-Muslim state. But at the same time, they're kind of arguing with each other internally with the Muslim League, created by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, seeking independence for Muslims from a Hindu state. So the Indian National Congress wants a united Hindu-Muslim state, and the Muslim League wants just a Muslim state. The English are also hostile to some of the worst aspects of traditions, kind of against the caste system, but at the same time they use the caste system, so it doesn't really help. But the British do abolish sati, and they do try to diminish the effects of the caste system, but they can't really get far because it's so intertwined. Now, British officials are often, or most of the time, accompanied by their wives, who are socially intellectual, kind of higher than their Indian subjects. Now, the British do have some positive impacts in this area, and some still mostly negative. They do have an increase in population due to food stuff, but also Indian people are going to leave India to work throughout the British Empire. This leads to mass migration of Indian people throughout the British Empire and the European influences. Now, if you remember last unit that the Europeans only could settle the exterior of Africa, and they couldn't really get into the interior of Africa because they would get sick, primarily from like diseases such as malaria. But they do eventually develop a medicine that allows them to truly become, resistant and kind of not immune, but resistant to the effects of malaria, which allows them to enter the mainland Africa. Right? And so what are they going to do? Well, they're going to carve it up for what is known as the Scramble of Africa, meaning that they're all going to meet in Berlin, and the Europeans are going to chop up all of Africa amongst themselves with no regard for borders or cultural anything. They're going to chop it all up, and they're going to divide it amongst everyone else. Divide it amongst themselves, I mean. So let's start with the French West Africa. Now, the French West Africa is really going to be known for its export of vegetable oils and cottons. By 1895, the French government will set up a centralized direct rule from Paris. All levels of government, the courts, everything is going to be run by the French. Now, the Mouridiyya brotherhood, these are a group of peasants, former slaves, defeated warriors. These all create a Muslim community during colonial rule. And this is really gonna be the main pushback against the French. But the French do expect the men to migrate for work. While slavery was abolished by the French, they still you can work for us, or we can make sure you don't get food. So what are you gonna do? What are you gonna work for them? So it's not technically slavery, but it is still slavery, right? Now, this is also going to lead to a great Muslim revival in West Africa due to Islamic education. Piety is going to make significant advances, and this is going to lead to Muslim revival. Not many people will convert to Roman Catholicism during this time. Again, quinine is going to suppress malaria. This is going to permit Europeans to live in Africa. But there is a big thing. The peanut. We have a peanut revolution throughout the region. Peanut is introduced to West Africa. Peanut grows super well in West Africa. So, boom. Big population growth because of the peanut. And this is also going to be, another introduction is going to be cotton for export. So last one for the day is going to be Nigeria. Now the British are going to set up 2 colonies in this area, northern and southern Nigeria, which are eventually going to merge into one colonial entity of Nigeria. Now, culturally, the British and Americans are going to set up schools and begin activities. And this leads to the rise of Western educated elites due to missionaries. Education is going to challenge the role of traditional elites. Because the only way you could get educated was to go to these missionary schools. Because there's no government-sponsored education in Africa by the English. Because they realized, oh man, if people become educated, they're probably going to rebel against us. So we're not going to set up government-sponsored education. Because that's what happened in India. And the British realized they're having trouble in India. Now, technology such as steamboats are used for, environmental transportation, weapons, modern medicines, made conquest easier. Railroads, electricity, roads, port facilities are going to expand and create a unified colony. Nigeria is really going to be a bastion. Even today, it's a very modern country because of this kind of constant kind of influx of new technologies by the British. Now, with the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in the 1800s, it's going to somewhat hurt the economy of Nigeria, but what they're going to do is they're going to just expand slavery within the African interior. So no longer can you transport slaves to the New World. We'll just have slaves in Africa. The British really don't like this, but there's nothing really they can do about it. So again, peanuts, yams are introduced to the region. Major food crop, population explosion. Alright, so that's the end of our notes for today. So thank you guys for listening along. Make sure you're taking notes. Make sure you're highlighting or writing down the vocabulary, and I'll see you guys in class.